Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Dis Affamie History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past, what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you.
In this episode of Dis Affamie History Podcast, host Wendy Aris sits down with Professor Cecilia A. Green, a distinguished sociologist, historian, and scholar of Caribbean slavery, race, gender, and colonial legal regimes. Together, they delve into her seminal article, A Civil Inconvenience? The Vexed Question of Slave Marriage in the British West Indies, powerful exploration of how enslaved people's intimate lives, unions, and kinship structures were shaped, restricted, and contested under British colonial rule. Professor Green unpacks the legal contradictions surrounding slave marriage, the ways enslaved people forged familial bonds despite systemic barriers, and what these tensions reveal about power, resistance, and humanity in the plantation world. Wendy and Professor Green guide listeners through the historical, emotional, and archival layers of this overlooked aspect of Caribbean enslavement, illuminating how marriage became both a site of struggle and a testament to enslaved people's resilience.
So thank you so much for Professor Green for coming on to the podcast, Dis Affamie History, and to talk about your article, A Civil Inconvenience, the Vexed Question of Slave Marriages in the British West Indies. And when I read this, I knew I had to reach out to you to discuss this, because sometimes we can be able to find these marriage records, and just to put into context. So I'll have you just briefly introduce yourself, and then we'll start with the podcast.
Okay, so I'm Cecilia Green, as you pointed out. Right now, I'm Emerita Associate Professor at Syracuse University. I was at Syracuse University for 14 years. Before that, 8 years at University of Pittsburgh. I'm definitely a Caribbeanist, a sociologist who specializes in the Caribbean. In fact, I've always felt as if that might hold me back a little bit, because it's considered to be such a small area of specialization. At the same time, I think you as a Caribbean person know that the impact that the Caribbean had in the world, right? And increasingly, I became interested in history. And so I really sort of identify now, to the extent that I identify as a professor anymore, I identify as a historical sociologist, because history has continued to fascinate me. I taught mostly classes on race, class, and gender. I was able every now and then to teach a course on the Caribbean. And I have taught a couple courses on sort of the comparative Black family, kind of looking at both North American, US in particular sources, and Caribbean sources.
Yes. Perfect. No, thank you so much for that, Professor Green. And, to start, what drew you to write the article, A Civil Inconvenience? And why is the question of slave marriage such an important, but of course, often an overlooked topic in Caribbean history?
Okay, well, first of all, as I kind of mentioned, my increasing interest in history, particularly colonial history, I've always been sort of interested in the intersection of what you might call kind of moral, legal, socioeconomic regimes, right? And the question of how do moral orders come about? Of course, this curiosity has been embedded in a much larger curiosity about the deep nature of colonialism, particularly its mechanics of violence, but also the moral orders that it has produced, right? We think of it just in terms of, violence and so on, but it does embed deep moral orders that partly negotiated by the people that it oppresses, right? There is very much this notion that these social orders, no matter how much they're forged in the crucible of violence and even terror, they're never just imposed social orders. They're also acted upon and negotiated, as I pointed out, by the oppressed. This particular case fascinated me because it showcases correspondence on the political, jurisprudential, and religious significance of slave marriage. And it's weighed into by local Anglican clergy, by local authorities, right? People on the ground, and by metropolitan authorities. So it gives us a spectrum on how are people seeing the question of slave marriage. Will it undermine slavery or stabilize it? Right? So it provides a fantastic opportunity for this sort of making of a moral order, both as it's imposed by authorities and how it's resisted by various parties, actually, not just the enslaved, who actually happen, as I pointed out, to be kind of excluded from that conversation, except we have tried to insert here and there their voices that we have gotten from diaries and so on and so forth. If I could just continue, because I think that opens up a light onto the article. I must say that as a sociologist, I've also been quite fascinated by the fascination of so many people with the nature of the Black family, right? Both as a kind of propaganda tool spouting its disorganized and chaotic nature. We've heard a lot about that, blaming it for all of the ill suffered by Black people in the Americas, both in the US, everywhere in the Americas, actually, Brazil, the United States, the Caribbean. But also, it's being seen as a sort of object of curiosity. And we see that most pointedly in the debate that I think most people are aware of, the debate between Franklin and Fraser, right? Who sort of, and Melville Herskovits. It was this thing, what is responsible for the nature of this Black family? Is it Africa or slavery? With, of course, Fraser sort of saying, basically accepting the judgment that the Black family was indeed chaotic and disorganized, sort of seeing it as a kind of Euro-nuclear, if you will, family manqué. In other words, always seeing it in terms of what it does not have, right? It's chaotic and disorganized because it's not organized on the basis of formal Christian marriage and so on. And on the other hand, of course, however, he does attribute this chaos and disorganization, we'll certainly have to give him that, to the brutalities of slavery, right? On the other hand, you have Melville Herskovits, who saw in the Black family sort of vestiges and sort of creative adaptations of an African ancestral past. Right. So this thing, so I was interested in that, wanted to go back and see, how did the mechanics of slavery sort of traumatize Black people in terms of family formation, but to what extent did they, despite all of it, adapt in ways that they could use these, if you will, strategies from African memory. And then, as you pointed out, I think there's the whole question of marriage itself. What makes marriage? What is it about marriage and marriage rights that makes it such a central component of status and invests it with so much power? What makes it such a dangerous proposition, right? Yeah. So we have an idea. I think we all have an idea why marriage invests men with what you might call paterfamilial rights or patriarchal rights, right? Of the father and the husband, to some extent over women and children. Marriage presumes the protection of the woman's chastity and exclusive sexual access to her. Marriage implies parental rights, right? Yeah. It implies privacy rights regarding the sanctity of the home and the accumulation of family property. And all of these would have interfered with the master's enjoyment of absolute property rights, right? We know what that meant, absolute access to the labor of its property, of its human property, and of course, just access to the sexuality of female slaves. So, marriage was problematic for them because it would have conferred certain rights of personhood, and such rights threatened to challenge the idea of the enslaved as civil non-entities, which is how they were seen.
Yeah, and then going on that theme, your phrase, a civil inconvenience, how does that reveal how the colonial authorities viewed enslaved people's attempt to formalize relationships?
Yeah, I was inspired very early on, but it's a very early, but maybe in the 70s, but quite an important article by a scholar called Joseph Magnoni. And he pointed out that the greatest bogeyman for the West Indian planter class regarding the status of the enslaved were formal marriage, literacy, and conversion to Christianity, right? They saw conferment of those rights. For them, the conferment of those rights would irreparably damage and interfere with the absolute property rights of the master over the slave. As I said before, both as a workhorse and as a sexual object, right? And I think I outlined some of the things. So this question really flows nicely from the previous one. The risk or the danger of giving patriarchal authority to the male and the prerogative of protection to the female, as well as certain rights which might, erode the master and slave relation of total domination. And I actually state and I can quote directly from my paper, that whites found the idea of converted, literate, and properly married slaves to be offensive and dangerous. It contaminated the exclusivity and sacrosanctity of European privilege and identity by allowing slaves to partake of them, if only distantly and symbolically. And it weakened the availability of the slaves as objects of exploitation. On a more practical level, I think I've mentioned some of the dangers. The whole thing of conferring patriarchal rights upon enslaved men. I mean, blocking access to enslaved women's sexuality, transmitting parental rights over enslaved children. I mean, all of these things would have been very challenging for the planter class. And this is why also, even the people who from the very beginning advocated very weakly for some form of recognition of the slave family, they tended, we'll talk about that later, the colonial authorities and even the early church, some people in the Anglican church. For them, it was just a way of stabilizing the plantocratic system, right? Not subverting it, just to stabilize it. And they really they tended not to talk about civil rights, interestingly, right? It was like, maybe we could, sanction these marriages by some show of a religious right, right? Some form of religious right, but not the kind of religious right that would have legal, sort of legal, recourse, if you will.
Yeah.
Right. And that they would essentially remain, sort of civil non-entities without rights. Right. Yeah.
Exactly. And I guess you kind of touched on it, but, what were some of the main reasons the British colonial governments resisted the legal recognition of slaves marrying in the West Indies?
Right. So, in studying the history of colonialism, as I was telling you before we started the podcast, one of the things I realized is the multidimensionality of colonialism, right? That colonialism was not just, like for us in the Caribbean and the Americas on a whole, it was not just a relation between master and slave. There were several levels to it. There was, the planter class itself, the owners of enslaved people and plantations. Mm-hmm. You did have the local authorities, who were the ones who would have to correspond, of course, with another level, which would be the metropolitan authorities. So if we're talking about British colonial governments, mostly as the metropolitan colonial governments, there were always tensions between them and the planters because, of course, they had an interest in the stability of the entire empire. Yes. And the empire, as you know, was, when we think that almost 90% of the entire globe was colonized at one point. It was not just the West Indies. I mean, the West Indies are remarkable in that they were the source of, at one point, the greatest source of wealth. And they were so important, but they were really quite tiny. So they tended to always advocate, and later on, also together with the West India community, what they call the West India Committee. That's a committee of absentee planters who tended, by virtue of distance, to sometimes take a more liberal approach. Mm-hmm. And so they did confer with them about, advocating for marriage. So they were not totally against it. But however, the point is that, and I think that's the important point, they had the right of disallowance of many of the laws against the slaves, right? And they practically never exercised that disallowance, right? They really kind of ultimately gave the right of the planter assemblies, to govern themselves and to govern their slaves. And that was the whole problem. And what it begins to change, of course, if you see even that period, what is called the period of amelioration. Yes. Then they began to be more activist in advocating for the improvement of conditions of the conditions of the slaves, and sort of advocating for some recognition of slave families. They tended to be more vocal around that. But it's important to note that in some ways it was to preempt the abolitionist movement, right? They were like, if we can stabilize this thing and preempt a more radical solution, we would advocate for it. But their advocacy was always very, very weak, and they really did not exercise, and I think that's the most important thing, those rights of disallowance. They disallowed very, very few of the atrocious laws passed by the planter assemblies.
Yeah, because they definitely wanted to ensure that their investment continued making them money, right? So
absolutely, yeah. And also we have to remember, we have to think a little bit of cultural imperialism. They were advocating for the adoption of European family forms because they could manage that better. They could, control the enslaved people better if they adopted some version of European family forms.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And I know that you touched upon this, but how did denying enslaved people the right to marry legally function as a kind of like a tool of control?
It's good to look at that separately. I think essentially it strengthened their status as sub-persons. I don't know if you know the work of Charles Mills. He talks about personhood, in a very important book he wrote called The Racial Contract. He's a Jamaican scholar. And he talked about the racial contract as really a contract between persons and sub-persons, right? And so it strengthened their status as sub-persons, and it confirmed their lack of civil personhood, right? I talked about the fact that marriage confers certain gender import. I want to qualify that by saying not just rights, but as we know, gender differentiated rights, right, of personhood and community. So by maintaining the right to separate families, spouses from each other, parents from children, as well as the right of unmitigated sexual access to enslaved women, no matter what their conjugal status, the plantation bosses essentially kept the enslaved community terrorized, right? And we must remember that there are people like Thomas Thistlewood. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. Yes, and his diaries have been prodigious. Diaries have actually survived. Yeah. And those diaries show that we're not just dealing with denial of the right to marry, but also the brutal management of sexual and conjugal arrangements among the male and female slaves of the properties he managed, right?
Yes.
And so he aggressively intervenes to uphold the exclusive sexual and conjugal claims to particular women of particular male slaves against the pretensions of others. And the important thing is that all the while reserving to himself the absolute right of access to any female slave on the plantation.
Exactly.
So I think, and also in terms of the female slaves, it should be pointed out that in many of these informally adjudicated situations of rival claims or unauthorized sexual relations, the woman is both denied human agency, right? So it's a decision about her. So he's sort of negotiating with rival claims among male slaves and over women. So the woman is both denied human agency or independent personhood. And she, more than that, she's often punished. If you read Thistlewood's diary, she's often punished as the transgressor in the first place. So as I said, essentially, it helped to keep the enslaved community terrorized. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, of course, with, do you think in terms of the enslaved people's determination to form family bonds despite the legal barriers, should this be seen as a form of resistance? Why or why not?
Yeah, absolutely a form of resistance. I mean, we have to remember that while, I mentioned before a very well-researched book by Jenny Gemot, published by University of the West Indies Press, entitled Ties That Bind Black Family in Post-Slavery Jamaica. I think it's 1834 to 1882. But she does point out that during slavery, there was less documentation. She's starting with the period of apprenticeship, right? Which is that sort of period of semi-slave, semi-free status of Afro-Caribbean people. And she finds that there is a wealth of information from the reports of the stipendiary magistrates, right? These were special magistrates who were appointed in a sense to sort of advocate against the planters on behalf of the enslaved. They often didn't, right? Depending on whether they were from the local planter class themselves or from elsewhere. But she has pointed out that this kind of wealth of information, you won't find it as much during slavery, but we have enough to know that they risked all kinds of severe punishment to visit their partners on another plantation, sometimes, traveling far, knowing that when they came back, that their sojourn abroad would be seen as an absence from duty, and they would be beaten, flogged, right? Parents often intervene to protect their children. You see instances of sometimes groups of women going into town, like in Jamaica, into Kingston, to the magistrate to complain about particular overseers, in terms of not giving them sort of authority over their children, kind of not allowing them a certain kind of a family authority, despite the fact that legally they had none. But nonetheless, as you know, they insisted on certain customary rights. They were not legal rights, but, they, by their own pushback, by their own resistance, they really tried to create a space for themselves, right? Another thing we should point out is that even during the period of amelioration with missionary activity, of course, because the missionary activity started in earnest around 1790, and they were critical in that period of amelioration and abolition, right?
Yes.
And they would actually, it's important to note that the so-called, and these were dissenting, were from the dissenting or non-conformist Protestant churches, because of course the Anglican Church, who had been present throughout, completely sided with the planter class and often of course, agents of the Anglican Church, who were themselves slave owners and everything, as dissolute as, the planter class was supposed to be. And so many times, missionaries actually did perform Christian rites of marriage, but it was not recognized, right? Because one of the things, that was another battle, where only marriage performed by an Anglican church official was recognized. And so I think they did not get the right, I can't remember the exact date, but they got the right for the marriages that they had performed for the slaves, for the enslaved people. I think only after slavery was done. But I'm saying all of this to say that even then you would think that there would be this huge embrace of Christianity, right? I mean, here these people often enduring themselves physical assaults. One of them had his house burned down, beaten, and so on. And that did impress the enslaved population. But nonetheless, we'll see that it never really convinced them that this Euro-Christian nuclear family or marriage was necessarily the way to go. And I think that's a form of resistance. That's a clear form of resistance. Because, Jemmott also makes that point in the post-slavery period when they had free. She points out, and it's true that many of them did take advantage of the right to marry, but for the most part, you would have anticipated, a much larger people flocking to get married. It didn't happen. And often the records from slavery that do remain, as I said, it's mostly kind of diaries of visitors, governors' wives, missionaries, sojourners of various kinds, and so on. And even to some extent, people like Thomas Thistlewood, they all point out, almost all of them talk about talking to enslaved women who say they're not for this marriage thing because it was going to give them a second master. They already have one master. And this formal marriage, they were not against, conjugal unions of some kind, but it was on their terms. And they felt that this marriage thing, I guess they looked at European marriage and they said, no, this is going to put a second master over me. And they explicitly rejected it oftentimes in that regard. And I think the mistake we make today, and we'll talk about that, is that when we look at family, we want to begin with marriage, right? And we shouldn't, because this is not how Black people sort of reckoned family, how they interpreted family. It doesn't start the way it's supposed to start, and everything that you marry, and that determines relations between men and women. It determines offspring, property, and so on. Everything has to be contained within this nuclear marriage thing. They rejected that, and I see that also as a form of resistance. So yes, there was this attempt both to retain actual family connections, and being willing to be severely punished over their rights of family, their chosen family arrangements, and then, of course, rejecting the kind of family, the kind of marriage system that the Europeans were trying to enforce upon them. Yeah,
exactly. Just one of these intangible connections that they felt was required for them. Now, I know that you kind of touched upon this, but again, in terms of how did this, lack of legal recognition for slave marriages affect enslaved people's ability to maintain their family ties, especially across generations?
Yeah, well, in terms of the conversation we had before the podcast started, I was thinking maybe you have a better way of answering that than I do. But let's acknowledge as I said, and I think we have to look at both trauma, of course, and creative adaptation, right? But let's start with the trauma. There was definitely family separation. It was not as bad because of the small size of the Caribbean islands. It was not as egregious as in the United States, where families could be separated across thousands of miles, right?
Yes.
And Gemma actually points out that she found less evidence of sort of attempts to reconstitute families in the post-emancipation period than in the US. So to some extent, in that regard, maybe we were lucky in the Caribbean. But there's still, as you yourself have noted, the lack of records, right? But as I said, I mean, Afro-Caribbean people do not necessarily begin with if you want to call it, conjugal couple when tracing family background, right? They have used other means. And this is one place where we can see this tension between what is supposed to be a more African focus on consanguinity, right? The system of extended kinship over that of conjugality. And I think that if you can trace it maybe through a direct ancestor, there's always, there's more of a continuity of that extended kinship.
Yes.
Right? The aunties and uncles and so on and so forth. The European way of sort of genealogical research tends to be, starting with these married couples and their children, and so there's more leeway in that way. We pointed to so yes, I mean, generally, of course, it affected it very negatively, but I think I'm saying that there are other ways. We talked about missionary records, the establishment of free villages, for example, where the missionaries really kept very, very detailed records of especially who was properly married and who wasn't, kind of thing. Family land, and the fact that the family land is accompanied by great oral traditions and so on. So I think there's still ways. There's still a lot to do. Like, you're right, we were talking about that. You're just beginning your journey yourself, and you're just amazed at the dearth of records. But some people have, I mean, I'm thinking of the work of, what's her name? Jean Besson. That's a Jamaican anthropologist who's he's done work on Martha Bray, Una Broadbent. So there are people who've tried to, Una Broadbent, who I think she interviewed many men. I think the book was called Standing Tall. She interviewed many men, some of whom were born in the 19th century. So there has been some attempt to trace family ties across generations, but I think it's a whole new arena for Caribbean people.
Yes.
And I do think that we have not really explored the records as much as we can. So it's a task, it's a challenge we're putting out there to both scholars and to the public. Yeah.
No, I definitely agree. It is definitely a challenge. However, you have to be very determined to get at this. And what you mentioned as well is, even if you're unable to find the records, there are other avenues, as you said, oral traditions. There are other things in terms of how we eat, how we practice our own lives, where it's coming from somewhere else through the generations as well. So would you say, I guess, for your article, that does it highlight the tensions between colonial law and Christian missionary efforts to promote marriage? And how did this clash or play out in practice?
Right. So we talked about that before, and I did indicate that if by that you're asking for the actual events that occurred and so on, that might be difficult. But I mean, we have to remember that the colonial authorities, even if they were sympathetic, and increasingly so as amelioration proceeded, sympathetic with giving enslaved people some family rights, I mean, they were still also wedded, say, to the concept of the Anglican Church, right? The established church as the Church of England, so to speak. So they had problems with dissenting and nonconformist churches, right? And I think, I can't remember the date, but they did pass what is called the Act of Toleration, which allowed missionaries the right to worship and to have churches and so on and so forth. And so, but the tension, I think, was much more, and that might be what you mean, between the missionaries on the ground and representatives of the planter class.
Yes.
Pitched battles where missionaries were often physically assaulted. You had the case that I mentioned of missionary who had his house burned down in Jamaica. But ultimately, the missionaries, because of their work among the enslaved, and the fact that they became allies, they became the eyes and ears and the almost the agents of abolitionism, right? Don't forget that we talk about colonial authorities, but there were parliamentarians who were abolitionists, right? And they started a real legislative movement towards abolition. So the missionaries became allied with that section of the British Parliament. And so the British Parliament, of course, was torn between the abolitionists, who were always a small group, and the majority of people who were for the status quo. So the missionaries were extremely important. And of course, as we know, with the formation of free villages, and that was a mixed bag, right? Because they also, for them, they saw, and I may be anticipating some of your other questions, but they saw a kind of, like marriage was denied the slaves because it was seen as providing a potential for freedom. For the missionaries, they saw marriage as almost a condition of freedom. And they preached that you can't be really free until you get married and you establish a proper male-headed household, and you establish the principle of dependent wifehood, right? Not just protecting the chastity of women, but also having your wife at home, right? They preach to the freed men and women, of course, that this was a condition of freedom, that they could not consider themselves truly free until they had a wife at home, kind of thing. And so I think the attitude of the freed persons to them were, we accept very much, of course, the what do you call it, the partnership and the assistance, but we're not so sure about these conditions, about Christian marriage. And one of the interesting things we see is that Christian marriage did accompany a lot, an increase in Christian marriage did accompany the establishment of these free villages. But the hope of the missionaries that often led these free villages, that Christian marriage would become the norm, that it would increase exponentially, that hope was often disappointed. It was often not met, so to speak, because really up to today, and today is a different thing. We can't even talk about today because marriage is not popular anywhere. It's almost like the Caribbean, Black people in the Americas were the advance guard of a trend which we're seeing, of a more general trend. But that was the pushback.
Go ahead. And just to kind of go on that theme of today, what parallels do you see between the denial of slave marriages rights and other forms of social exclusion that persist today?
Yeah, the first thing that comes to mind, and I think that will come to everybody's mind, of course, is the difficulties of maintaining this sort of exclusion of LGBTQ persons, exclusion of their right to marry. And that may not be true. It's under challenge, though. That right to marry, which they've successfully won in the United States, is currently under challenge. But we know it doesn't exist in the Caribbean. And also the persistence of oppressive homophobia. That's certainly one of the first things you almost think of when you think of, debates about marriage. That is the grand debate on marriage, right? Do LGBTQ people have the right to marry or not? But I think we also have to kind of acknowledge certain reforms that have, to some extent, restored dignity and full personhood to Caribbean people, right? So you think of the banning of the concept of illegitimacy, which we saw in happening with, I think, started by Michael Manley. He was the first, and then other Caribbean governments followed. And then earlier on, You had ridiculous things like, teachers who got pregnant outside of marriage were forced to resign. They lost their jobs. So-called illegitimate children were denied access to certain schools. They were not legally entitled to share in the inheritance of paternal property. So I think we should acknowledge, some reforms that have taken place. Common law or consensual unions and out of wedlock births are no longer occasions for the kind of ostracism against certain classes of persons. But I think there's still a misunderstanding of how Afro-Caribbean people understand marriage, understand family, right? As I said before, that marriage doesn't sort of create family, that right?
Yes.
That there's the anthropology said, oh, in the Caribbean there's this sort of disconnect between marriage and family. Marriage and family do not presume one another. So I think that there is still we still don't fully understand that, and that's still a job to be done. Where I don't know how the legal system, because I don't know all the family laws of today, how it deals with family. But I very much doubt that the Caribbean legal system is, corresponds with the positive ways in which we need to understand families, not so much as what is missing from it, but what is present. Right? What enriches the kinds of families we have today? Yeah.
No,
I'm sure there are many exclusions that I should be thinking of, but I suppose the whole thing of, one of the things that bothers me is the extent to which the state, maybe takes responsibility for children, for the welfare of children, for helping women regardless of their marital status. With the with supporting children, right? Yeah.
And I guess, how should this history, reshape how we understand the institution of marriage in post-emancipation Caribbean societies?
Yeah, as I said before, I think that we shouldn't begin with what's missing. And it's a task that we still have before us, that when we understand maybe not the institution of marriage, but families in post-emancipation Caribbean, we need to maybe avoid the tendency to start with marriage. But I do think it's important to see how the institution of marriage may have changed. Yeah, but I actually keep thinking it's more important for us to understand what is present within this family form, and it's the whole thing of, some accounts. I don't know if you must know the literature on the Black family, right? The Negro family in the Caribbean. I mean, oh my God, you had R.T. Smith, M.G. Smith. The anthropologists and sociologists were obsessed with trying to understand what is this family all about. And I do think that we need to acknowledge both and some people to some extent, like M.G. Smith, who was a Jamaican anthropologist, said that, it's just a different kind of family. So he actually is the one who introduced the notion of cultural pluralism. You have the Europeans, you have the brown middle classes, you have the European upper elite, the brown middle classes, and the Black lower classes. And they all have different cultures. And he simply said that, right? And then R.T. Smith was the opposite, where he said, no, we have to understand this family form as part of a unitary system. And what happens is that the Black lower class is disadvantaged by the low socioeconomic status of the male, and that explains the weak role of the male in the family, so to speak. Well, this kind of either or thing, I think, is untenable. We have to understand both trauma. We can't sort of say there's been no effects of the trauma. Of course, there have been effects of the trauma, right? To some extent, by not giving men certain patriarchal rights, they were also divested of responsibility, right, for the welfare of their spouses and their children. You have to be very careful about that because, well, even Gemma too in her book and several other people, for example, there's some important work there's certainly an article by Randy Brown and Trevor Bernard on husbands and fathers during slavery, insisting that men were central to the family. But at the same time, I think we have to acknowledge the trauma, the fact that the so-called irresponsibility of men and so on is an experience that many women have, right? And that might be, we might trace that to the fact that, in taking away their rights of fatherhood, not necessarily patriarchy, but fatherhood, they were also divested of the responsibility in a sense. And maybe that has trickled down to some extent. But also both trauma but creative adaptation, right? And then that's where, using elements of West African sort of cultural principles, the focus on consanguinity rather than conjugality, right? On extended kinship. I think this is how we need to understand the family. And even today, of course, the institution of marriage is still not very popular. Exactly. Right? As I said, I mean, it's losing popularity everywhere. So it's harder to talk about today, because somebody might say, well, the institution of marriage is not is low. The rate of marriage is low, but it's low. It's getting pretty low in other countries as well. But yes, and of course, the good thing is that the institution of marriage, the meaning of it is changing in the Caribbean as elsewhere, right? Yes. Yeah. And of course, I'm sure in the sociology is this whole thing about, common law unions. Yes. And the variety of family forms. I think whatever criticisms we might have of people like Edith Clarke, who wrote My Mother Who Fathered Me, M.G. Smith and so on, they did show that there's a variety of Caribbean forms. So it's important for us not to assume homogeneity, right? And so, for example, Edith Clarke, when she looked at these 3 different villages, Sugar Town, which was a plantation town, where the people who came in every year for harvesting the sugar cane, that there were very unstable unions among them. True as well in the urban area, but the long-term residents of Sugartown had very stable, relations, so-called faithful concubinage. In other words, there was a lot of stability. Then she looked at Orange Grove, where people tended to own their own pieces, their own farms. And she saw much more proclivity towards Christian marriage. So it also depended on a number of things, the forms of land ownership and so on, the class background of people, the desire for middle class respectability, right? So her third community she looked at was a community called Mocha, which was based mostly on family land. And again, you had, extended kinship with the women owning their own land, community land, so to speak. And there as well, she found so-called faithful concubinage, like, long-term common law relationships and so on. So I think we also have to understand marriage as having appeal for particular classes of people, not so much appeal for others, but really not ultimately defining what the Black family is, right? I mean, historically, when we think of the Euronuclear family, marriage sort of began a family. It was the precondition for having children, for building a family community and so on. In the Caribbean, obviously, it's not the precondition. It has never been the precondition for starting a family, for having a family. So this is something that I think remains important today.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I know that this next question you've touched upon it already, but it's basically just the differences. So if enslaved people were denied the right to legally marry, what does that tell us about whose relationships were deemed worthy of protection?
Right. And that notion of protection is important because essentially what we see even in the post-emancipation is the kind of demarcation between protected and unprotected women, right? Where mostly the women estately who remained on the estate were sort of seen mostly as kind of unprotected women. Their labor continued to belong to the owner rather than to husbands or anything like that. I mean, both forms have levels of patriarchy, but certainly the notion of unprotected women. As I said, that was an important demarcation because, for example, the people who even established free villages, right, are very much founded on these missionary principles of proper marriage, right, that dependent wifehood, that the wife should be at home kind of thing. It was not just the elite marriages that were seen as being deemed of protection, but, for those who conformed, right, who conformed to even the sort of working classes, those who conformed to this notion of marriage were seen as worthy of protection as well. And of course, in that case, that form of protection tended to be very much linked to land ownership. You see very much that in situations where there was this independent or semi-independent peasantry, right? One of the things you see with the free village movement is that, and even we have to remember and previously enslaved people who formed their own communities, built their own churches, built their own schools and so on. Often kind of the leadership of those communities, showed a pattern of, the whole thing of the male leaders, right? The male leadership and sort of the wives of the respectable wives of those male leaders. So that idea that this kind of family was worthy of more protection, I think, for obviously among the elite. Right. But one of the things we have to remember is that all of the terrible things attributed to so-called illegitimacy, the Black family, they're responsible. If you look at all of even the Moyne report, you wouldn't believe the Moyne commissioners, they often said, it seems as if illegitimacy has caused all the ills of the Black population. How kind of the Black family has been seen as, the font of evil, so to speak. And the idea that, marriage is going to fix everything. But it's very interesting. If you read, and I've read many accounts of, the diaries of governors' wives, well, there are a couple of governors' wives of visiting sojourners, people who sojourned in the Caribbean for a while, visiting officials, Monk, Matthew Lewis, absentee planters who came to visit their plantations. They all talked about, these kinds of problems, important sources actually of what happened. I think what I was going to say, and I hope you cut that piece off. What I was going to say is that if you read the accounts, they're mostly talking about the whites as profligates, white men, as they see rampant profligacy among the white population. It's very interesting, after not even kind of, considering what Black people have been put under, the kinds of stresses, kind of blaming them for their own problems. And you look at these older accounts where they're clearly saying that this has been imposed, well, some of them at least, yes. This has been imposed on a hapless Black population, right, by whites who were completely dissolute. They were shocked at the state of white society in the Caribbean. And so we need to go back and look at those things, when people apportion blame and so on, and blaming the victim. We need to go back and look at, how the accounts of the Black family really kind of proceeded in terms of witnesses and people who really understood. And if you look at even the diary of a Matthew Monk Lewis, right, that kind of somewhat liberal visiting proprietor, he points out instances of enslaved males proudly parading their children, proudly bringing their children to see him, right? So another understanding that the Black family was flourishing during slavery, and the male present Black family was flourishing during slavery. So I mean, I think we do have to acknowledge the trauma and the way it continues to resonate today. I don't see how we cannot. I mean, we're not doing like Fraser and saying that, oh, it's all chaos and disorganization and it's because of the brutalities of slavery. But but the brutalities of slavery have to be accounted for. Exactly. And we do have a legacy of trauma to contend with. We need to be celebrationist, but we can't be only celebrationist. We have to weigh both the trauma and the creative adaptation, and the use of very strong ancestral traditions to survive up to today. Yeah.
No, absolutely, because we need them both, and we need to acknowledge, because that's the only way that we can be able to move forward as a people and to grow. And finally, Professor Green, what message would you want to leave the listeners to take away about the resilience of enslaved people who insisted on forming and maintaining loving bonds, even when the law refused to recognize them?
Well, in a way, the question answers itself, right? That they insisted on forming and maintaining loving bonds. I just mentioned the case of, this enslaved father who, even during slavery, proudly displayed his children, brought his children to visit the visiting master, so to speak. I think we need to just remember that in order to understand the resilience of the Black family, that we do not begin with what appears to be missing from it, but we begin by trying to understand what is present, the tremendous struggles it took to insist on ties of, as Jemmott calls them, ties that bind, right? And her book, I think, goes a long way to show how, in the immediate post-emancipation period, when Blacks, African Caribbeans, were finally sort of given access to, a kind of judicial, if you will, reckoning, they were finally given, they were actually seen as litigious, right? They were seen as, oh my God, these Black people love courts and they are just so litigious, but they were adamant in gaining family rights, right? And so as much as they were seen as being so litigious, using the courts, right, to gain their rights, they were also being criticized for not engaging in proper Christian marriage. Yes. I mean, which shall it be? It's damned if you do, damned if you don't. Exactly. If you press your case in terms of your right to family, your rights to your children, to some extent over your children, your rights to partnership, and so on, you're being seen as litigious. On the other hand, your failure to engage in so-called proper Christian marriage is seen as an indication of barbarity. Yes. That's just utter nonsense, and we have to understand that Black people built families with purpose, and they pushed back at all times. At the same time, not denying the tremendous trauma that they underwent.
Yes. No, thank you so much, Professor Green, for coming on and taking the time to speak about this article, because it is very central, and all of the themes that you've indicated here in this episode is very, as I said, I've seen it on both sides of my family tree, and it really is central to how people to view marriages and what happened during that time. So thank you for coming on to the podcast.
Thank you, Wendy. It was my pleasure. And keep on doing the great work that you're doing.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hoped you enjoyed this episode. And if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcast. Thank you.